Thanks, everyone. Thanks for sticking with me for the whole month. This has been really fun. I would really actually love to do this again. And, so I've been thinking about it. I teach on lots of things about fairy tales. I do intro to fairy tale. I do feminist transformations of the fairy tale. I've been thinking a lot about different kind of adaptations. So if you ever want to have me back, I would really love to come back. Probably. Do you guys offer classes in the summer?
No.
Oh, okay.
That's not.
Wait, in the summer would be a little bit easier, but I could do winter or spring is also a little easier. I'm realizing like fall is really hard because it's a very busy time of year. So, today I want to talk a little bit about the Colored Fairy Book series, and it's really known as Andrew Lang's Colored Fairy Book series. But as you'll learn in a few minutes, it was really produced in many ways by Nora Lang. So I call it the Lang's Colored Fairy Book series. And then I'll situate that within the context of the British Empire during the 19th century. So the Colored Fairy Book series was published during the last part of the 19th century and into the first part of the 20th century. So that's sort of important context. In many ways, the extended Victorian era, which would, kind of stretch from the late Georgian period, which ended in 1837, and extend all the way to the early parts of the Edwardian period, which began around, 1901. That extended Victorian period, we can think of in many ways as the century of the fairy tale in Britain. And the craze for the fairy tale really started with this lawyer who translated several of the Grimm's tales from their collection, and he published it as German popular stories. And in 1823, his name was Edgar Taylor. And German popular stories became incredibly popular and kind of inspired this fairy tale craze in the United Kingdom and in Britain in particular. But one of the things that was so incredible about it was how popular it was. To put it in context, far outpaced the popularity of the Grimms in Germany at the time. And in fact, it was so popular that Wilhelm Grimm, who I talked most about last week, who did a lot of editing of the Grimm's tales, he modeled the small edition. Remember, I talked about the small edition that specifically had the very two explicitly anti-Semitic tales in it. He modeled that after Edgar Taylor's German popular stories once he saw the publishing success of that. And then, so that kind of initiated the craze. And then at the other end of that long century were the Lang's Colored Fairy books. And there were 12 of them. Of course, Britain's long 19th century was marked by much more than just the fairy tale. It also saw a burgeoning market for children's literature, a really unprecedented growth in commodity culture, and a more professionalized form of anthropology that was underpinned by social evolutionary theory, which I'll talk about in a minute. And of course, as you know, it was also in many ways the height of empire. And now not only the British Empire, but other European countries really participating in land grabs and things like that. By century's end, this kind of Victorian penchant for the fairy tale was wholly integrated with these various social, political, and cultural changes. So it was imbricated with the rise in children's literature, with empire, and with the professionalizing anthropology. And all of these things come together in kind of unbelievable, to me, and beautiful fashion in the Colored Fairy Book series. So during his lifetime, Lang was a very well-known public intellectual. He had a reputation for making authors careers by giving them good reviews. And he was kind of a, we could say, a Renaissance man or dilettante. And I don't use dilettante negatively, because that's often how I'm described as an academic. So I get bored kind of easily. So I move from topic to topic every decade or so. So he did everything. He wrote poetry and was a critic of poetry. He defended adventure and romance fiction. He wrote public essays. He had an ongoing column. He translated Greek mythology, and he wrote criticism of Greek mythology. He worked on fairy tales, of course, and he published in anthropological magazines and venues. And like I said, he was very invested in this thing called social evolutionary theory. And in many ways, again, all of these interests of his come together in the Colored Fairy book series, including his interest in Greek mythology, which some of the Colored Fairy books actually have Greek myths in them. So most people don't really know Andrew Lang today, except for through the Colored Fairy book series. But in his day, he was a very powerful public intellectual. Yet, as I kind of mentioned, he wasn't as responsible for the production of the 12 Colored Fairy books as his name on the cover suggests. And in fact, it was really primarily the work of his wife, Nora Lang. And she says something to this effect in writing to an American journalist in 1912. This journalist was asking about the fairy books, and Nora wrote, "I also wrote the bulk of all the fairy books after the first 4 and edited and often rewrote those stories contributed by other people. My husband never saw the stories until they were ready for press, when he read them through and wrote the preface." And so again, this is in 1912. Andrew had already died by this time. So we could take this as an exaggeration of Nora's sense of her contributions that Andrew couldn't respond to. Mark?
So does that mean that Andrew did Blue Fairy Book, Red Fairy Book, the first 4?
Yes.
That he was responsible for?
He was responsible for doing more of that work, although she always was a translator. He didn't have much facility with languages. But so again, this was written to this journalist after Andrew had died. He couldn't contest this representation. But what we know is that he himself actually agreed with this and said so in the preface to the Lilac Fairy book of 1910, which was the last one. The fairy books have been almost wholly the work of Mrs. Lang, who has translated and adapted them from the French, German, Portuguese, Italian, Spanish, Catalan, and other languages. And she really did have a facility with languages, but it also was not that unusual for educated women of the time to know these languages, in particular to know European languages. Those were seen as lesser languages to Greek and Latin, which were languages that scholarly men would have known. So even though the fairy books were almost wholly the work of Mrs. Lang, it was really Andrew who framed the series through the prefaces to each volume. And one of the prefaces, I don't have the quote here, but it's great. He talks about how, like Adam, he is, Nora is like, cultivating the garden, but he's like the overseer of it. So it really gives you a very clear sense of how he imagined himself in relation to both her and the series. But he really was the one, as Nora here is saying, who wrote the prefaces, and in the prefaces is the framing for each volume, but also for the series as a whole when we read them together. And it's in the framing that he makes clear his very deep and enduring belief in social evolutionary theory. And really, he brings folk and fairy tales as evidence of social evolutionary theory, which, as it sounds, is this idea that all people progress along the same evolutionary trajectory. So that, and at the pinnacle of that trajectory is sort of British civil society, elite, educated British society. So we could look back at peasants in Britain, and they would be just like one little step behind in that evolutionary trajectory. And we could look all the way back at Aboriginal Australians, for instance, or Indigenous Americans, and we could see our savage past, right? Because everybody, all groups of people would have gone through the same stages of evolution, and we're coexisting. So we can see in front of us the history of our past. That's social evolutionary theory. And for Lang, he really believed that fairy tales were evidence of this, and we see this in many of his prefaces, but in the preface to the Green Fairy book, which is the third of the fairy books, but it's really the one that has the first real preface of any significance. The others are kind of like a paragraph or two. He says, however much these nations differ about trifles, they all agree in liking fairy tales. The reason, no doubt, is that men were much like children in their minds long ago. And so before they took to writing newspapers and sermons and novels and long poems, they told each other stories, such as you read in the fairy books. They believed that witches, could turn people into beasts, that beasts could speak, that magic rings could make their owner invisible, and all the other wonders in the story. Then, as the world became grown up, the fairy tales which were not written down would have been quite forgotten, but that the old grannies remembered them and told them to the little grandchildren. And when they, in turn, became grannies, they remembered them and told them also. In this way, these tales are older than reading and writing, far older than printing. And the other idea that should be clear here of social evolutionary theory is the further back you go, the more childlike you are as well. So this the sort of maturation of the individual is mapped onto the evolution of different humanity, basically. So this account of the fairy tale as evidence of social evolutionary theory really recurs across all of the fairy books after this first green one. But what is especially notable or noteworthy to me is that as the series evolves, the old grannies really become increasingly distant in both time and space, and also in culture, and so and class, from the presumed readers of the colored fairy books. So the tellers now become naked savage women sharing stories with naked savage children, and they're likened to our naked ancestors thousands of years ago. Or they are peasant or savage grandmothers, note the equivalence there, and some savage grandmother telling tales to her savage granddaughter. So this reframing of the old grannies telling stories to their little grandchildren, the transition from that to these naked savage women telling stories to naked savage children, or peasants being equated with those savage grandmothers, that transition also maps onto the movement of the series further and further away from Britain. So as the series goes on, each colored fairy book includes tales from areas that were more and more remote and more foreign or exotic to British readers, right? So in the Green Fairy book, where we saw the old grannies telling stories to the little grandchildren, that collection was primarily comprised of tales from Europe. And the only tales in that collection that weren't from Europe were from China. And at the time, during the 19th century, even though there were mixed feelings about China, it was definitely seen as a civilized society, right, during the Victorian era. Later volumes, when these old grannies become these naked savage women, we see a much, much wider range. And you'll note that these are from some of the later books in the series. And by this time, stories were coming, Andrew or Nora or others contributing were getting stories from anthropological magazines and journals, as well as from missionary reports or people sending in, or other collections that missionaries and anthropologists had published, often to study the language, but they were these repositories of stories. So later collections had tales from Aboriginal Australia, from Zanzibar, from South Africa, which was called Baranga, from Indigenous America, India, Estonia, Lithuania, Serbia, Armenia, Turkey, Japan, Finland, and Lapland. And again, you can really see the movement from tales from Europe and the British Isles outward, and the way that that tracks with the transition from the old grannies to the naked savage women.
Question.
Yes.
What's the definition of savage?
It's actually, there's a technical definition that Lang is referring to, and it is on the social evolutionary scale. And I can't remember off the top of my head if primitive is the very bottom and then savage, or if savage is the very bottom and then primitive, but they're defined in ways by, like, do they have fire? How do they cook? What kind of social organization do they have, et cetera? So I apologize, I don't know the exact definition. Yeah.
How accurately did they retell these stories?
Yeah, not accurately at all. And I'll get to that in a moment, like really not accurately at all. And we, in my book, I do look at some of the old texts from the anthropological journals, so I can really compare like the ways that they have edited these stories. And I make a case for why and how they edit them in particular ways that I think aligns with this. So the other point I want to make about the movement in time and space and culture and geographical location, and the movement, the way that parallels the movement from the old grannies to the naked savage women, is the use of the present tense. So remember, when we're talking about the old grannies, they were telling these tales, or in earlier stories that, well, here I have it, our earliest civilized ancestors who really believed that beasts and stones could talk, right? So that's in the past, but when we're talking about the naked savage women, it's in the present, right? These stories are as old as anything that men have invented. They are narrated by naked savage women to naked savage children, right? So a contemporaneous existence, right? A real focus that these people still exist, and not only that, they still believe. I don't think I have any examples, but there are a couple quotes from the prefaces where Andrew is actually saying that our ancestors used to believe this, but they still believe this, right? So there's this shift in tense. So this kind of, I just highlight this distinction because it really, to me, kind of encapsulates social evolutionary theory very nicely. And we can see the ways that Andrew reframed that and set that up for children, right? So the children were definitely the target audience here. Oh, and I should just say that as an aside, this like very obvious racist logic that underpins social evolutionary theory is we can't just attribute that to the historical period as if like, oh, well, this was happening in the 19th century, everything was racist. That certainly wasn't the case in Britain. And in fact, racist ideas like those that underpin social evolutionary theory were quite contested in the 19th century. And there were already notable figures like Mungo Park, the adventurer and explorer, the abolitionist Thomas Clarkson, the freed slave Aladu Equiano, and they all described Africans and Asians in highly positive terms as early as the 18th century. And they certainly weren't alone. There was real attention to abolition, to questions of slavery, as well as to imperial conquest and the quote unquote savage nature of that. So one reporter from the Times, for instance, described the savagery of the British toward Indians, South Asian Indians, following the Cawnpore uprising of 1858, and wrote, quote, "The British cannot govern India justly until they have first learned to repress their own racialist attitudes by governing themselves." So again, questions of empire were deeply entangled with ideas about race, but not everybody held them. So we can't look at Andrew and nor Lang simply as products of their time period. I'm making an argument that they were much more actively engaged with questions of empire and race than would have just been the passing kind of environment. Sure.
So how does this map onto what was the science of the time in terms of genetic thinking, or not even genetics?
I was going to say there wasn't really that much genetic thinking. I mean, like, well, I don't know when Mendel was, but
Freud's, what is it, phylogeny recapitulation?
Yeah, that's-
sort of.
that's a lot of this kind of idea related to social evolutionary theory, right? Because we see the reproduction of the species along the reproduction of the individual. And that's exactly what's happening here. So there certainly were anthropologists. So again, the professionalization of anthropology was really important at this time. And Freud also wrote Civilization and its Discontent, so was also immersed in these kinds of conversations. And there are people who have tried to look at the way that Lang is in conversation with Freud, some of Freud's work, as well as with some of the anthropologists of the day. Yeah, so that was an emergent science, and it was also a contested science, even from the beginning. Okay, so let's see. So, okay, that was my side about racism, not being just what everybody experienced. So returning back to kind of the story of the Langs, as I mentioned at the outset, in addition to the 19th century sort of being the century of the fairy tale, it was also the century of children's literature in a lot of ways. And again, that literature for children was also deeply entangled with questions of empire and with race. So the most obvious example that we have is adventure fiction, which was really targeted at boys. And adventure fiction really was a kind of obvious and unwavering mouthpiece for empire. I mean, it's just, there's no other way to say it. It really inculcated colonial values in young male readers, especially. And in fact, some military recruiters and others are on record as kind of saying, oh, these halfpenny magazines and these penny magazines really can be our high enrollments can be attributed to them because they inspired such fervor. And adventure fiction for boys was so ubiquitous. There were just hundreds of different halfpenny and penny magazines weekly, as well as, propaganda tracts, novels, and adventure fiction was even written into some textbooks that a lot of literary scholars have studied boys' adventure fiction in the British imperial period, but many of them argue that adventure fiction for boys is actually responsible for driving the whole expansion of children's literature, in addition to driving empire in some ways. So as a boy, Andrew Lang was one of the hundreds of thousands of boys who really cherished these tales, and that was a love that stayed with him over the course of his whole life. So he loved the novels by Walter Scott and Robert Louis Stevenson and James Fenimore Cooper and Mayne Reid, and he even co-wrote a adventure novel with Ryder Haggard. It's terrible, but but he did do this. He was very across his entire life, he defended adventure and romance fiction. Yeah.
I wonder what the role of African folktales is in all of this.
Yeah, so there were some African tales, and I can talk a little bit more about that if I have time at the end of class. So the African tales that were included in the colored fairy books were sent in by missionaries, or they were taken from missionary collections or from anthropological publications. But those were often recorded very faithfully because they were intended to help people understand the language. And the Langs took those stories, Nora especially, and rewrote them. I argue in the book, exacerbated particular kinds of difference and smoothed over other kinds to highlight the distance from sort of white British citizens in ways that played on stereotypes. And yeah, if we have time, I can give you an example of that. There are a couple pretty interesting examples. And there are some fairy tale scholars who have done pretty close analyses of just like one story from the Anthropological Journal to the Lang's version. Let's see. Okay, so yeah, Andrew Lang, adventure fiction for boys, very highly gendered, obviously. But if Andrew's imperial values were highly gendered, so too were Nora's. As I mentioned, as a translator, that was a very common gendered role, but she was also an adapter of the tales and Andrew's helpmate. Again, all very traditional roles, but and Andrew acknowledges that it was so typical for women to play these roles that Andrew's acknowledgement of Nora's contributions are pretty minimal. The stories have mainly been adapted or translated by Mrs. Lang, although there is one case where he really does reveal the ideological work that she does. He names a couple that are translated by a few other women, and then says all the rest are told by Mrs. Lang, who does not give them exactly as they are told by all sorts of outlandish natives, but makes them up in the hope white people will like them, skipping the pieces which they will not like. So there you can really see the very active engagement in the editing process. And I'll come back to this, but I just point this out here to show that both Andrew's and Nora's work with the Color Fairy book series is highly ideological, right? It wasn't that Nora was just kind of going along with Andrew's choices. She too was actively engaged. And we can really see her ideological investments in the work that she did on her own before the Colored Fairy books were published. That her main work from that period is a 3-volume geography primer for children, which again was a highly gendered genre. This was one of the genres that women were really allowed to work in and publish. And so they would write these things like with these frames of like a mother just kind of teaching something to her children. So it was very modest claims to authority and expertise. But these geography primers were incredibly popular, not quite as popular as boys' adventure fiction, because they probably weren't as fun to read, but they were extensive in the 19th and early 20th century. So this Megan Garcia, who's a literary historian, explains geography primers for children represented a, quote, sizable imperial tradition in which women writers penned geographies that marshaled history, religion, economics, and anecdotal evidence to establish the social and cultural supremacy of England. These were really, in many ways, to keep pace with the sort of unbelievable expansion of the British Empire. So, and just to put that in a little bit of numbers for you, between 1815 and 1914, so a century, Britain added 100,000 square miles per year, okay? Per year, that's huge. That's somebody's phone, not mine. And these geography primers really did satisfy the demand for information, especially information intended for children about Britain's possessions and Britain's colonial others, right? And they really fit into this expanding landscape of children's literature. So
that was going to be my question.
Yeah.
The ideologically driven fairy tale writing by the Langs, there was a market demand for it, or were the editors saying you
Yes.
have to whitewash this? into something acceptable to our readers.
No, Andrew was such a public figure that he could dictate that to the publishers. And these were huge sellers. They came out around Christmas every year, so they were good Christmas too. Yeah.
Commercialism.
They're still in libraries.
I'm sorry.
They're still in libraries. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
not all of them, but the.
Yeah, no, you can, I bought the whole 12-volume set as reproductions, when I was working on this project. Yeah, and they were reproduced exactly as they were with the same illustrations and everything. They're still available. Nora's geography primers were published, as I mentioned, again, in 3 volumes in 1881, 1882, and 1883. So almost a full decade before the colored fairy books were published. And they fully conform to the genre of the geography primer for children. So hers were titled, the 3 together were titled A Geography, Physical, Political, and Descriptive for Beginners. And it really, the set really seeks to introduce children to the world according to the genre paradigms established across the century. And again, from Megan Garcia, these women spent comparatively little time locating territories, concentrating instead on the hermeneutic move of positioning them in relation to England, Britain, Europe, and the established colonies, a move that helped instantiate, quote, a meaningful framework of imperialism through which children could come to recognize their own small island as a, that should be mighty, empire entitled and even morally beholden to rule the rest of the world. So, right, it was really from Britain that these geography primers were being produced, so it reproduced those perspectives. The first volume of Nora's geography is broken into two parts, the British Isles and the British possessions. And again, the bridge between the British Isles and the British possessions is sutured by that imperial logic. One of the most remarkable facts in English history is the conquest and possession by the little island of Britain of all the great countries that make up India. Right. So again, very true to the genre. Also in keeping with the genre, volumes 2 and 3 move outward from Britain. So volume 2 covers the European continent, and volume 3 covers Asia, Africa, and America. So you can see the kind of balance, right, of the volumes. The 3 volumes are, kind of peppered with these ethnographic snapshots that combine in very seemingly random fashion elements of physical description of people's cultural practices, beliefs, and attitudes, and super overgeneralized group-based characteristics. So for instance, before Europeans colonized Australia, the country had no corn and no domesticated animals like pigs, sheep, and cows. The natives therefore lived by hunting and on wild roots and grasses. They were cannibals and ate each other. Okay, right? Like in Labrador and along the coast bordering the Arctic Ocean live a short, ugly race called the Eskimos, who also inhabit the neighboring great island of Greenland. The Annamese branch of the Mongol race are lively and brave, but cruel and treacherous, and are great shipbuilders, right? Like they're so random. Borneo is peopled by Dayaks of Malay race, but taller than the generality of Malays and lively though homicidal. Okay, so you really get a feel. Interspersed among these very brief but presented as if comprehensive descriptions are slightly more detailed descriptions of the quote unquote more civilized cultures, as well as explanations for some of the beliefs of the savages. So when read together, I think these sort of historically inflected sketches again evoke the kind of social evolutionary theory that we see in Andrew Lang's work. The Ainus of the Japanese Empire are quick and clever, but more prone to adopt the inventions of others than to invent themselves, and they long ago borrowed their military system from the Chinese. Or the natives of Australia were chiefly governed by men who pretended to be wizards. They are often called the lowest of savages, but probably they do nothing which our own ancestors did not do long ago, and they are clever in their own way. So again, this kind of movement back and forth between condescension and outright racism in these ethnographic sketches was totally typical of 19th century geography primers in terms of the imperial tone and the attitude. But where Nora's 3-volume geography primer really differed from others is in the treatment of slavery. And although abolition was contested, the British abolition movement and the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833 were, for many people, very, very critical components of national identity. And that is to say, Brits often put their anti-slavery or their pro-abolition positions up against, like, the Dutch, for instance, to say we're much better, we should be the colonists because we don't endorse slavery in the same way, right? So even though slavery was incredibly critical to the expansion of the British Empire, by this time it was also something that, especially for children, was being critiqued. But not so much in Nora's primers. And in fact, what's notable is kind of the real absence of any mention of slavery, or very little mention. And when she does mention it, it's very vague and anodyne, and probably most child readers wouldn't have picked up on anything. But there are really, truly only a handful of references to slavery throughout the whole 3-volume set. So, for example, the commerce and prosperity of Jamaica have, however, much diminished since slavery was abolished in 1838, owing to the difficulty of obtaining labor, right? So very, again, anodyne. Elsewhere, she very euphemistically refers to the slave trade as an importation, as though human beings were any other trade group. Haiti was the first island settled by Columbus, and very soon after the colonization of native Indians were all exterminated, and very soon after the colonization, the native Indians were all exterminated and their places filled by Negroes imported from Africa. And again, the population of Brazil is composed of, among others, imported Negroes who are allowed to buy their freedom for a small sum. These are like the most direct references to slavery. Perhaps most notable, though, is the case of Barbados, which was a sugar-producing island. And here, and we know that sugar plantations demanded huge numbers of slaves in order to be productive. So here, slavery is completely erased. Oh, sorry, that was supposed to be an animation. The second part, I gave it away. The cultivation of the sugarcane can be carried on here successfully, owing to the dense population. That's all she says about Barbados. But what we learn later is that she, of course, would have known about sugar production and plantations in Barbados because she was identified as, in social registers, identified as Leonora Blanche Allen, youngest daughter of C.T. Allen of Clifton and Barbados. I'm missing a parentheses there. Sorry, my slides are a little messy today. So she came from a multi-generational family that owned sugar plantations in Barbados, and yet makes no mention of them in her geography. And in fact, her father was compensated for slaves who were freed under the 1833 Slavery Abolition Act, which to me makes clear that even though that was before Nora was born, she would have understood and indeed highly benefited from the extent of slave labor that was necessary for sugar production in Barbados. And so again, her father was compensated in 1836 for the freeing of 717 slaves. The British government paid him 12,000 pounds, which in today's value is $2.2 million, right? So he was quite wealthy just in the compensation for the freedom of those slaves. Really what I'm trying to draw out here is that Nora, like Andrew, was complicit in the project of empire, independent of their collaborative endeavors, right? That is independent of the colored fairy books. And in many ways, Nora's geography primers anticipates the kind of tenor of Andrew's prefaces with those kind of like pithy ethnographic and often pejorative references. Of course, in the geography primers, Nora's ethnographic snapshots refer to adults. When Andrew goes to write the prefaces, he orients them more toward children. So we see, for example, red Indian children who never go to school nor see pen and ink. We meet the Kafirs in Africa whose dear papas are not so poor as those in Australia, but have plenty of cattle and milk and good mealies to eat and live in big houses like very big beehives and wear clothes of a sort, though not very like our own. Or the brown people in this island of New Caledonia, where a boy is never allowed to speak to or even look at his own sisters. Nobody knows why, so curious are the manners of this remote island. And actually, anthropologists at the time, of course, did know why. So you can really feel this. It's really, these are all from the Brown Fairy book. Oh, good, I put that there. It's really in the same preface that Australian children get the lengthiest introduction. And here we really see how the ethnographic snapshot blends description, value judgment, and pure fancy. Even though more uneducated little ones running about with no clothes at all in the bush exist in Australia, they have no lessons except in tracking and catching birds, beasts, fishes, lizards, and snakes, all of which they eat. But when they grow up to be big boys and girls, they are cruelly cut about with stone knives and frightened with sham bogies, all for their own good, their parents say. And I think they would rather go to school if they had their choice and take their chance of being birched and bullied. However, many boys might think it better fun to begin to learn hunting as soon as they can walk. So again, just some flavor here. And finally, at the same time, Andrew encourages child readers to explore geography primers to learn more about the regions where these stories originate. No doubt, many children will like to look out these places on the map and study their mountains, rivers, soil products, and fiscal policies in the geography books. Of course, what we learned is the geography books don't actually have much of that information. They have much more of that kind of ethnographic snapshot. But I like to provide this quote because I think it really makes clear that ideological affiliation between the Victorian fairy tale collections that are really exemplified by the Colored Fairy Book series and children's geography primers, right? And that sort of affiliation was not only reflective of empire, but actively advanced the work of empire in the way that it targeted children or was marketed at children. At the same time, it's important to note, I think, that the Lang's Colored Fairy books were published at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. And this was also a moment of anxiety among some about the British Empire, right? The strength of the British Empire. In the waning decades of the 19th century, we see the rise of other European colonial powers, as well as shifts in domestic powers that were inspired by the expansion of the franchise, right? As well as turmoil over Irish home rule and mounting xenophobia. So all of these things coming together at a moment when people were really beginning to wonder about the strength of the British Empire and also what to do about that, how to shore up the empire. So one fairy tale scholar refers to the Colored Fairy books as a symbolic commonwealth of nations, a spell against the disintegratory pressures of an empire in decline. And I want to suggest, though, that as this kind of symbolic commonwealth of nations, the Colored Fairy books do more than offer sort of a talisman against the sort of waning or demise of the British Empire. They also really exemplify this 19th century British desire for collecting. This was an activity that occurred across almost all domains of British culture. This kind of removal of objects, whether they were natural, material, cultural, intellectual, or geopolitical, from their native environments in order to recontextualize them in a new environment that is specifically the environment of the collection. And this would have also been the time when we see the rise of displays of these collections in museums, for instance, in gardens, in all sorts of places, in the British possessions, right, these colonial holdings. So in many ways, the collection can really be understood as a form of control and containment, right? It's creating a hermetic world. And I think that in many ways, that's why collecting among Brits was so popular during the 19th century, right? It was a way to control and contain these objects from far-reaching places that were unfamiliar, right? And so in this way, I think the Colored Fairy Book series really allows for the control and containment of Britain's imperial others by children. And in this way, it was very similar to the geography primers and also to puzzle maps that were intended for children, that were all part of decontextualizing others and colonial holdings and places and recontextualizing them through a British frame. With the tales in particular, we see the removal of them from their native categories like genres. They probably were not all called fairy tales in their native context. And they were, we don't know anything about how they circulated, how they were used, whether they had ritual function, whether they were told for entertainment. We know none of that context because they're recontextualized in this series. And I argue that that recontextualization not only allows children to kind of control and contain these British colonial others, but also universalizes the European fairy tale, right? The sort of designation under which this whole series exists. So all of a sudden we have wonder tales or genres from a wide range of cultures that probably have their own native categories, and they're produced here and universalized in the Colored Fairy Book series. And what we see in this global cultural commodity in the sort of closed world of the fairy tale is that we see the sort of erasure of the fact that many of the tales are, quote, made up in the hope that white people will like them, right? And instead, with that erasure, we get simply just this idea that everybody has fairy tales, right? Okay, I think I'm going to leave it there. We're right at about the 40-minute mark, so 10 minutes, and then
Yeah.
did I go over? I went over.
Let's make it 5.
5 minutes. Yeah, great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm sitting down.
Okay, so we'll get started again. I'm just following Doug's orders. As I hope was clear from the first part of class today, the Lang's Colored Fairy books really, as I mentioned at the end of that section, bring together a wide range of what we could call wonder genres, right? Not only fairy tales and folk tales, but legends and ideological tales and myths, but also a bunch of genres whose designations we probably don't know because they would have been from their local native context, and we don't know what they would have been called or how they would have been used, but they're all brought together. All these wonder genres are brought together under the sign of the fairy tale. And as I mentioned, I think that's really been made universal through these series like this, as well as others that we've kind of talked about in class. But really the Langs, I think, do the best job of this, as Mark was just saying, as a children's librarian. The colored fairy books are canonical. They were extensive. My mother grew up reading them on Kauai, right? They had a very wide distribution. I don't think it's an over-exaggeration to suggest that those books did a lot to make the European fairy tale into this European genre by making all the other tales conform to it in that way. So what I want to do now is really close this class with a couple examples of post-colonial and decolonial adaptations and responses to the European fairy tale. And I call, so my book is called Spectres of the Marvelous. And so I call this kind of decolonial and post-colonial response a spectral politics of wonder. That is an engagement with the kind of like haunting of of race that is not present, but not explicitly present, but so very much there in its ghostly resonance. So I want, as you can see here, I want to start with this. How come the slides won't go? There. What happened with this book by Bolo Babalola from 2020 called Love and Color: Mythical Tales from Around the World Retold. Even though the Langs series, the colored fairy books, really make these claims to the universal, they were obviously undeniably Eurocentric in their framing. And that elision of the universal and the Eurocentric, I think, is made especially clear in this collection. So Babalola both reimagines 10 culturally diverse wonder tales and challenges the Eurocentric orientation of quote unquote worldly fairy tale collections. And her stories are beautiful, evocative, effective, they're affective, poignant, they're really wonderful adaptations, and they draw from tales that have generally been excluded from the European fairy tale canon. And she lists her sources by heroine for each of her stories, and each story is focalized through a female heroine. So here they are: Osun from the Yoruba myth, Scheherazade from 1001 Nights, Nefertiti, Atem from this folktale from Nigeria, Iya from the Asante tribe, Sia from this ancient Soninke legend, Psyche, which we all know, Naleli from Lesotho, Xenu from China, and Thisbe, who you may also know from Mesopotamia. But you can see the real range. So in anchoring her stories to this set of tales, Babalola really re-articulates the cultural makeup of the world, right, as represented by most English language collections of international tales. And her re-articulation of the world is made even more powerful, I would argue, by the fact that it's not marked. It's completely unmarked. That is, even though Babalola is rewriting the sort of colonizing dimensions of anthologies, she's not saying anything about that, right? She doesn't have a preface in which she says, I'm rewriting this. So it just stands on its own. Yeah, Matthew?
Is she writing in English?
Yes, it's in English. She does allude in her acknowledgments to the erasure of Black women, such as herself, in these works, but she still refuses to frame her collection as a corrective, right? It is just the world. And in this way, the world, as she defines it, as the world, with an absence of any authorial notes or any editorial notes about how she made her choices or how her choices are interventions, etc., really naturalizes this set of stories as the world in exactly the same way that people like the Langs naturalize the Eurocentric emphasis as the world. And even more, Babalola presents this collection as a celebration of love. That's the thematic connection among all the tales, although they're not all happily ever after kind of love stories. But she says that they're all rooted in her desire to, quote, explore how the power of love has been expressed within a variety of cultures from around the world. And here I would argue that this emphasis on love also kind of unsettles or responds to the fairy tale in particular, because as we talked about in the very beginning of class, the fairy tale is the kind of hegemonic genre of love, right? It's a stand-in often for love. In many ways, then I would argue that Babalola's polysemous title, that is, this title that has multiple meanings, love and color, not only condenses the book's interventions, but also resonates with specific histories of the European fairy tale collections that have sustained its kind of universalizing reach. So for starters, to return to the cover art, we see a Black man and a Black woman closing in on a kiss, and their clothing and the abstract backdrop are bright with shades of yellows, reds, greens, and blues, and the colors that are really associated with African art and textiles and flags. And this to me suggests that at least one of the meanings of the title's invocation of color involves race. And she does say, again, only in the acknowledgements, she has kind of a shout out to, quote, the young Black women who sent me messages telling me what this book means to them, who saw themselves in me. And I think that kind of acknowledgement further supports this idea that at least one of the meanings of color has to do with race. I think, yeah. Oh, I was supposed to say that too. I was like, I know something is supposed to go there. Yeah, so again, about being seen in all your iterations and every dynamic brightly and in color. But of course, I think the color in Babalola's title also conjures the Lang's colored fairy book series. And it's not difficult to imagine that a British Nigerian writer and cultural critic with a self-proclaimed devotion to love and a fascination, also self-proclaimed fascination with fairy tales and wonder genres, would be familiar with the Lang's series. And that here's where I was supposed to put this. Most compelling, I would say, is that the intersection of the two is her declaration that this book is about being seen in all your iterations and every dynamic, brightly and in color. So what I'm trying to argue is that Babalola's adaptations restore color, that is race, to the European or to the wonder tale, the European or universalized versions of which really expunge racial reference through increasing metaphorization over time, as we've been discussing, and also through very specific editorial decisions driven by the perceived taste of white people or white readers, as we saw in the Langs. So that's the first case. The second case is, I would argue, and I'm trying to think about these two cases together to really have us consider how color features prominently in, again, this thing I'm calling the spectral politics of wonder, that is in these decolonial or post-colonial responses to the European fairy tale as a universal genre. So the second case I want to talk about is an artwork by Surinder Dalwal called The Green Fairy Storybook. I don't think I have to make too much of an argument that it's in conversation with the Langs. So This is from 2009, as you can see, and it's comprised of 14 brightly colored handmade books that are all standing side by side on the table. And on the spines, if you read across the spines, which is hard to do here, I'm going to read it for you. Dolly Wall offers a version of her story, her history and her art. And she says, once upon a time, there was a little girl who loved learning to read, sitting on the floor between the stacks in the public library, surrounded by piles of books. The green fairy book, the yellow fairy book, the red, the blue, the lavender fairy book. She's convinced many years on that there was even a violet, lilac, and a purple book. This early love of color is reflected in much of her later life: gamboge, heliotrope, rose madder, madder lake. This work represents a resolution of sorts, a coming home to the place where all the narratives she has written began. So Surinder Dhaliwal is a citizen of the Indian diaspora. She was born in Punjab. She was raised in London and then in rural Ontario, Canada, and now she lives in Toronto. And she describes her work generally, which is fascinated with color, as mediating, quote, childhood memories and the experience of migration through artistic engagements with, quote, issues of identity, the slippage between here and there, and the intertwining of colonial histories. Much of her artwork seeks to, quote, fix some cultural dissonances that she's experienced and to create beauty from past traumas. So again, the Green Fairy book, the Green Fairy storybook obviously invokes the colorful legacy of the Lang series. And Dhaliwal inscribes the surface of her twinned storybooks with another set of colors: gamboge, heliotrope, rose madder, and madder lake. And these colors are born of Western and primarily British imperialism, exploitation, and colonial violence. They have incredible stories. So as an example, gamboge, which is the color of traditional robes that monks in Buddhist monks in Southeast Asia wear. Gamboge is created from the sap of deciduous trees of the Garcinia family, which are native to Cambodia. And that the source is represented by the color's name, which is derived from Cambodia, an early form of Cambodia. And the pigment was first brought to Europe by the British East India Company in the early 17th century. And there's a fascinating radiolab story on this, but they were producing gamboge at the same paint manufacturer all the way through the 20th century. And in the 80s, someone who was processing the pigment, which comes in these chunks of kind of like hard resin, found all these bullets in them. And it turns out that they were from the killing fields. So we can really see like a long cycle of Western violence in relationship to this color in particular.
What color is it?
Gamboge, oh, it's that kind of like orangey yellow color, the color of kind of saffron. People would maybe say saffron of those robes. Heliotrope. Heliotrope was discovered as a color accidentally in 1856 when William Perkins, a chemist, was trying and failed to synthesize quinine from coal tar. And the search for quinine was, of course, itself intertwined with British imperialism, not only because the British Empire depended on quinine as an anti-malarial drug for its soldiers and civil servants in India, but also because British expeditions, quote, raided the highland forests of South America looking for the hot commodity cinchona seeds, and it's the bark of those quote unquote fever trees that was the source of quinine. Rose madder is a shade of pink, and one historian of color notes that, quote, pink as a concept arrived in Europe in the late 14th century with shipments of Brazil wood dye. So Brazil wood extraction, it turns out, marks the start of the Brazilian colonial period. And the name Brazil comes, the name of the region originates in that first exploitable resource. And even more, colonial Brazil's export economy was largely powered by slavery. First, Indian slaves who were hired or enslaved to cut Brazil wood, and then later African slaves. Madder Lake is older. It can be traced to ancient Egyptians who used the madder plant, the root of the madder plant, as a dye for textiles. But one historian really emphasizes its prominence as the color of empire. And she writes, quote, "Madder Lake found its calling when, in the 17th century, it became the color of the British Army's red coat. As Britain expanded its colonial outposts globally throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, Madder Lake grew into the color of empire." So, read against the imperial histories of these particular colors, I want to argue that Dhaliwal's haunting reincarnation of the Lang's Colored Fairy books captures this complex inner working of nostalgia, love, and violence in a very beautiful and intimate fashion. So, you know, you'll remember from this part of the installation, which is across the spines of the book, she encourages her early love of color and what color represented, that is stories, to grow into the colors of empire, right? Colors whose brutal histories really she is seeking to reclaim in all of her works. And in this piece in particular, I think we see Dhaliwal calling to the surface, that is very literally to the covers of the books, the largely unspoken imperial ideologies that are framing the Lang series, right? So we see that. But she's also identifying the series as, quote, a resolution of sorts, a coming home to the place where all the narratives she has written began. So here I want to suggest that even more than kind of braiding her own personal story with the imperial histories of the colors that she's later going to make her own, that Dhaliwal is really illustrating the seemingly benign but severely cruel and lasting effects of a child's racialized exclusion, right? Even if she's not aware of it at the time. The kind of racialized exclusion that is facilitated by the Langs as they make up and edit tales in the hope that white people will like them. Yeah, sure.
Kim, so do the books have any content inside them, or are they blank?
I think they're blank. You can't touch them. So I did see it in person, and you can walk around it, but they're not accessible to be open. So really, I believe they're blank, and the text is all on the spine.
Well, it was the exclusion, the racialized exclusion, that made me think that the blankness might be part of the
Right.
story.
Oh yeah, that's a great point. I hadn't thought about, but part of the symbolic meaning interpretation.
Where is?
It's in a gallery in Toronto. I saw it at the Art Gallery of Ontario, which is a big museum, and there was a Dhaliwal retrospective, and so I saw a lot of her works, and she's very fascinated with color. Yeah. Dhaliwal's characterization of the piles of the colored fairy books as the origin of all the narratives she has written, I would argue, is not so much a tribute to the Langs, right, as an unsettling reminder of harm, even or especially if that harm is perpetrated by an early love, right? Because we see here too her love of the books and her love of learning. And I gave a version of this talk about the Langs in my department, and my friend and colleague Valashni Kupan, who some of you may know, and who, like Dhaliwal, was raised in the transnational Indian diaspora, said with very poignant and inspired humor, quote, "I read all 12 Lang collections over and over as a kid, burning the empire deep into my soul." So I really understood, even though Valashni was kind of joking, she also wasn't. And when we understand or think about Dollywell's whole oeuvre, against or alongside Voloshiny's articulation. That is, when we think of like all the narratives that Dollywell has ever written, whether they're visual, textual, filmic, she does make films, and all of her works address themes that include the arrogance of British imperial cartography, the violent after effects of colonial partition, identity, migration, and belonging, exploitative extraction, collection, and classification, all again in the name of empire. I think that her piece we can really see as what I like to think of as a welcome balm for the long-lasting burn of the Lang's colored fairy books. So I wanted to conclude our class with these two examples because they remind me of the wonder, right, in our world, a wonder activated not only in stories, but also in ways of living and being with and through stories. So I hope that these readings of Babalola's and Dollywell's responses to not only the Lang's colored fairy books, but also to the universality, the supposed universality of the European fairy tale as represented by the Lang series might help us, return to the wonder in our own world. And I hope that that's a wonder that can embolden us in this long, and I think we're seeing very relentless battle against legacies of racist hatred and violence that continue. Instead, I hope that we can look at the wonder in our world and really that we can turn to that wonder and find inspiration for justice that will sustain us in rich and colorful ways. Yeah, so thank you. I have one more slide, which is that some of you said that you were interested in talking to me about other things. And I have a website, which is like totally foreign to me. So everything that I talked about in this class is in my book, which is coming out soon. So I promise I didn't offer this class just as an extended promotion for my book, but many of you have been interested in wanting to know more, and there's so much more detail. Like for instance, in the Lang chapter, I talk about two or three stories that they rewrite, and one is a native story, a native from Canada, a First Nations story, where they really, again, word things and add things to exacerbate the kinds of differences and to make suggestions about the quote unquote savage nature that just simply aren't there in the original story. Or, in others, there's one African story, I can't remember the specific area that it was collected from, but the Langs rewrote it. There were things in the story that would have been very familiar to British readers, like a telescope, but that was completely written out of the story. And instead, the things that were highlighted were the ways that this old man who was, it's kind of like a Puss in Boots story. He was being made to seem more than he was to trick a Shaw into giving him a bunch of stuff. So anyways, he had to clean himself, and so he was cleaning himself with dirt, which wouldn't have been that unusual, right? Like dirt was a way of scrubbing in certain colonies, but in the 19th century, with the rise of commodity culture in Britain, soap became a symbol of civilization. So there were actually advertisements that said soap is civilization, and they were often like a black boy and a white boy, and they'd be washing, and like the blackness would wash off of the black boy except for his face. So you still needed to know that he was black, but you also needed to know that soap could make you symbolically white. And so I do readings like that of the Langs, specific editorial choices and adaptations. And so there's a lot of rich material here, and I didn't really have time to go into it all, but thank you. Yeah, Alison?
Well, I appreciate you at the end talking about Sabindo Tawali and how she brings the bomb to the burn, the Lane collection. So I had questions about correction and about telling stories in a new way. So I was thinking about, like, we went to the Natural History Museum in Oxford, England, and it's an amazing museum where they have collections from all over the world from their colonial, amassing of artifacts. But they have displays now, which are corrections and disclaimers about a lot of things, and they don't, for example, they don't show the shrunken heads anymore
Right.
because it's disrespectful
Yeah.
to the.
And maybe they've repatriated them.
Yeah, and some, some.
Yeah.
And, but I'm thinking also about, the Disney fairy tales and how, and other TV and things that we see more. I mean, a lot of people grew up with fairy tales. I don't know about children so much now because it's been a long time since I had a young child, but, Disney has a lot of disclaimers for their films, like Aladdin now. If you try to watch it on TV, read a disclaimer first about the kind of racist tropes
Oh.
and things that are in there.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's interesting.
And then, Aladdin, Aristocats, there are just a lot of different ones.
Yeah.
Dumbo, all of that.
I mean, Dumbo has a literal chain gang. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. when they're
And,
putting up the tents.
And then there's been, just in the 21st century, new stories being told with diverse characters, with people of different, and women too, girls, like Moana, Mulan, The Princess and the Frog, and this kind of thing. So, do you see that this is in like your academic circles, so people talking about these corrections and new things, or even like Bridgerton and how they have such a diverse cast, which may not be really reflective of the
Yeah.
1700s, but they're trying to tell stories in a new way, and just anything you can
Yeah,
comment.
I have a whole analysis of the Disney thing, so I didn't know about the disclaimers on some of those older racist films, so that's amazing to me and great. Disney's response to its kind of, to some public claims that like all the heroines were white or whiteified, and that was really problematic, and then the Princess and the Frog, so then their production of these other films that you just mentioned tried to, I think, address that, and we could say maybe appease a particular part of the market. And that also mostly coincides with the reproduction of the live action versions of the classic fairy tales, like Beauty and the Beast and Cinderella, and then I'm going to start with those two, which were some of the most popular Disney originals, right? And totally white. And the live action reproductions are totally consistent with the animated versions. So I feel like Disney did this brilliant thing of releasing these films with mostly girls of color, and at the same time starting to release these re-releases really in live action of the classic white fairy tales, right? And we know that in the marketplace, the animated ones with protagonists of color have just not been as successful as the classic Disney fairy tales, but the live action ones have been super successful market-wise.
I didn't see it, but I think the
The
Little Mermaid.
Yeah, so then the Little Mermaid and Snow White have been super controversial because the Little Mermaid cast Halle, I always want to say Halle Berry because that's how old I am, but Halle Bailey, who's a light-skinned Black woman as Ariel, the mermaid, and there was huge controversy. And right now there's a controversy around Snow White because they've cast Rachel Zegler, who is not white enough for them. I think she's Latinx, but I'm not sure, but there's a lot of the same controversy that was around. And the discourse is around, let's not be woke, let's just save the classics or whatever, right? When you look at her, like I wouldn't have, if I hadn't read all this stuff, I wouldn't have known that she wasn't white. She's very white presenting. And so it's still like all the discourse is pretty nasty online, as you can imagine, but an interesting, another interesting dimension of that one is that they've made her like some of the Snow White filmic adaptations, like Snow White and the Huntsman and some others. They've made her into more of an active protagonist, and people also don't like that, right? She should not be a superhero. She should just be waiting for love's true kiss. And if you remember the Grimm's version, which is the animated Disney, the source for the animated Disney, the prince, when he comes across her in the glass casket, he asks the dwarf, can he have it? Right, because it's such a beautiful object. And so, anyways, that has always been pretty telling to me. I do a reading of that in my classes, like, you know, this never feeling fantasy. Obviously. The other thing that's interesting about the live action Snow White is that Gal Gadot is cast as the evil stepmother, the queen. And she's Israeli, she's an Israeli actress, and so there's all this controversy about like, if you go see that film, are you supporting Israel in this current moment? Yeah, Disney's become super politicized in that way. Yeah.
So when you purchased your set of the fairy tales, the Lang, it doesn't come with any kind of disclaimer.
Oh, no, it's 100% reproduction of the original, which is why I bought it actually, because I knew that I needed to mark it up and things, and I couldn't go to an archive, and I also couldn't afford to buy the vintage ones. And so yeah, I don't really know any of the Grimms certainly don't have any disclaimers either that I know of. I mean, some certainly newer translations may have, like in the preface, maybe some, but really I'm not trying to toot my own horn, but like no one's really done work on race in the fairy tale in any kind of like detailed way. You know, they'll kind of say like, oh, that ogre could be a racial other or something, but they're not, like, people just haven't done that work yet. And so it's not that surprising to me that there aren't that many disclaimers in the collections, in the text. Yeah.
Just a quick question that may need a long answer, but you don't have to, but how did you get started?
Oh,
when did this begin, the idea?
Yeah,
Just 1 minute.
Get going. I'm trying to think, someone else asked me that. So I wrote this book on Angela Carter, who's a feminist writer who retold a bunch of fairy tales, and that got me deep into the Grimms and Perrault and other kind of classic fairy tales. And then as I was teaching on that, I started reading some of the Dolonois tales, and I was like, that's really weird, and that seems racist, like just like to me, it just reminded me, there's this one story where there's this princess who washes up on the shore, and she's raised by ogres, and but they don't eat her, and she learns to speak ogre, and so she can communicate with them. And I was like, that's really weird. There's some like weird colonial story going on here, and then this beautiful white prince washes up on shore, and they fall immediately in love, but they have to learn how to communicate because she's been raised by ogres and she only speaks ogre. So I was like, there's definitely something going on here. That's the story that I really think of, where I'm like, oh, okay, something. And then as I started digging, and then obviously the Bastille really has a lot there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.